From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Grant Harris. I'm head of the European Reading Room in this European division. And we're very pleased to have today Igor Fedyukin speaking to us about the schools that Peter the Great built, projectors, and the state in early modern Russia. And Professor Fedyukin works at the National Research University, the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He's an associate professor of history there, but he's been here since September in Washington, D.C. as a Woodrow Wilson scholar. And he only has about 2 more weeks left, and then he goes back to Moscow. So this is, for us, kind of a high point. We get to hear from him some of what he's been researching while he's been here. And part of that topic is the schools that Peter the Great built. That's just part of a larger book that he's working on. There is this conception that Peter the Great, pretty much he was so great he did everything. He created schools, he created all these institutions, but in fact he did not do this single-handedly. And what Professor Fedyukin will be talking about today is the greater role played by the administrative entrepreneurs, or they use this word projecteur also. So I assume they take that from the French,
right?
Very much. And it was they who pursued their own career goals and pet ideas and competed for status and resources when they were heading or administrating these various institutions. So Professor Fedyukin, thank you for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you, and please help me welcome Mr. Fedyukin for being here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and it is certainly a high point of my stay here, to be able to talk here. I'm really grateful to a number of wonderful institutions which made this talk possible. First and foremost, of course, the Library of Congress and the European Division. That was a really sort of unexpected and very, it's a huge honor. Also, of course, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, which that enabled me to spend a wonderful year here working at the library. As you might know or might not, the Woodrow Wilson Center actually has a program where they let you do sort of interlibrary loan, actually sort of requesting books from the library to be brought to your office. And I just sort of didn't do that. Prefer instead to come here, both because I'm very sort of conscientious, yeah, and care about the books a lot, and just kind of really bothered me a lot to make a book travel kind of all the way from here or like over there, like to the Wilson Center and back. But also because it's just nice to be here. It's such a wonderful library, such a wonderful reading room, and just great to be here. And it's my particular pleasure to present here my project, my book project, which is finished by now. It's under review at one of the major publishers. Hopefully, it will be joining showing up in your catalog, at some point, maybe next year or year after. And indeed, it's about schools. Now, when we talk about schools in Russia, education in Russia, modern education in Russia, of course, we think that the first thing that comes to our mind is that, well, it's a state-run schools, right? It's a state, whatever it means, that administers them, creates them, staffs them, funds them, determines the direction of their development. But what does the state mean? Today it's easy, right? there's the Ministry of Education and Science, for better or worse, right? Which that's what it does, right? Appoints directors, rectors, creates institutions, merges them, closes them down, funds them. Well, in the 18th century, throughout the most of the 18th century in Russia, as elsewhere, there was no Ministry of Education and Science. So how did it work? And indeed, it's very easy because, of course, we have Peter the Great, who single-handedly was creating everything, designing all the institutions, all the wonderful new ideas, projects, innovations. All of them are traceable to his insights, his energy, and his just vision. And of course, he did all of that because he was creating a new regular army, and so it was natural, and a navy, and engineering, and fortresses, whatever, right? So it was natural for him to establish schools. Modern, secular, technical schools. Now, Peter the Great was a great ruler, no question about that. So my purpose today is not to undermine, his claims for greatness and, for vision. And he certainly was a very active ruler, no question about that. I mean, if we go into archives, we'll find piles upon piles of documents which he personally edited. He would really sort of spend like days or weeks personally in his own hand, kind of editing successive drafts of whatever regulations or documents for his navy. I mean, whatever documents he considered important. Kind of writing entire sections sort of from scratch in his own hand. So no question about that. The problem is that the schools were not one of those sort of topics that he really wrote much about. I mean, we know Peter as a great sort of educator of Russia, right? Of course, and creating new schools, teaching his subjects, instructing them in the new secular technical sciences. It's one of the trademarks of his reign, right? Well, the problem is there's not much of a paper trail. What we really have from him on schools are, just sort of like one-liners. Teach young guys arithmetics. Well, that's very important that he sends this message, right? And we appreciate that. But as any of us who had ever had anything to do with administering things, we realize that, there is a huge gap between this sort of, let it be kind of, thing and actual institutions. Somebody has to actually determine teach where, teach whom, teach how, who should be doing the teaching, how those people should be funded. And I mean, I don't want to sound as if, I'm trying to retroactively impose our modern kind of standards of administrative kind of efficiency, administrative clarity upon, 18th century people. No, I mean, if we look at his contemporaries, his officials, they do formulate, this problem that, it's just kind of too vague. I mean, one of his most famous decrees on education, on schooling, is his 1714 decree on so-called cipher schools, decree which set up a network of cipher schools all over the empire. Like 2 teachers were supposed to be dispatched to every province to teach young guys arithmetics. Well, and that's what here's what one Andrei Belyaev has to say about that. And Mr. Belyaev, he was an experienced official. I mean, he spent his entire career in the sort of administrative agencies, and he was not some like reactionary or conservative, who was like against teaching. I mean, he was actually a close associate of this one person whose name is Leontiy Magnitsky, who was his most prominent teacher of mathematics at the time. He was his patron. He was very closely involved with managing the so-called navigation school, a sort of very important school at the period. So he was empathetic towards schooling and learning and studying. But here's what he has to say. I mean, and he writes to his immediate superior, Admiral Apraksin, referring to this February 1714 decree on cipher schools. This decree is obscure, mrachin, and without many of the conditions which should be there. If you order us to implement it, more specific chapters ought to be sent to us, and without them, this business of cipher schools can be neither extended nor even established. And so he lists, specific questions which has to be answered before he could actually proceed with implementing the decrees, like, who should be his counterparts in the provinces, how many teachers should be sent, like, and so on and so forth. Or in 1720, Peter orders that 100 apprentice pilots be taught, and again, among the Admiral Apraksin's papers, there is a copy of this decree, and the anonymous official left this addendum on the margins. And what they are to be taught and how they are to be maintained in the said teaching, there is no exact resolution on that. So there's this gap. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on Peter, in the sense that, how exactly should the kind of modern secular technical school for officers, for sailors, for artillerymen, how exactly should it look in that period was not immediately clear. In the sense that, if we go into sort of to Western Europe in the early 18th century, those kinds of schools are only beginning to emerge there as well. The British Navy, right? The Royal Navy didn't have any school for training, naval officers until until pretty much the end of the 19th century. They would train aboard ships. Midshipmen would get some basic education, whatever schools were there on land. But then, as for actual navigation, they would actually go on board ships and learn as apprentices, learn kind of by doing. They would be involved in practical kind of in practical tasks, and perhaps the captain would spend a few hours a day or a week, kind of instructing them in mathematics. But that's all. And actually, when Peter himself, of course, all the education he got himself was through this kind of personal tutorship, right? As all other kings, of that age would, right? But when he famously went to Western Europe to learn shipbuilding, the Dutch or the English, what could they offer him? He had to learn by doing again, the wharves, kind of through this apprentice, sort of non-formalized, non-institutionalized kind of apprenticeship. So those things are only being invented. And my question is, how exactly they were invented? And here I want to talk about the specific school. It's called the Naval Academy. It was established in 1715 in St. Petersburg. An important school, sort of one of the first schools of the kind in Europe, actually. It trained scores of admirals and naval officers, and of course, lots of graduates, went elsewhere, sort of pursued careers in government or other technical branches. Now, how exactly was it created? We know that Peter created in 1715, and we know that its founder was this guy called Baron de Saint-Hilaire, a Frenchman. Not much is known about him until, of course, yours truly came along. But it was generally assumed that he was probably French, admiral or naval expert who was, by Peter to set up the school. I mean, it was also known that he was fired pretty soon after a couple of years, and it was known that he had like all sorts of tensions with his Russian colleagues. So it was assumed that he had this sort of very troublesome kind of personality. And now, what was how did it actually work? I mean, this Baron de Saint-Hilaire, he was born in southern France, in Bordeaux, I think, in a merchant family, in the bourgeois family, and his name was Allaire, Joseph Allaire. He was involved in trade for a while, got imprisoned for insurance fraud, sentenced for galleys, escaped across the border to Spain, where war was going on, the war of Spanish succession between the Franco-Spanish army on the one hand and the Anglo-Portuguese army on the other hand. So he somehow gets in touch with this French commander, and he's employed for a while as a messenger between the French camp and Lisbon, trying to arrange for separate peace negotiations with the Portuguese. After a few months of doing that, he goes over to the English with the papers, thereby sabotaging, these separate peace negotiations. He's taken over to London. He gets 500 pounds. The English at that point know him as the Joseph Haller, a merchant. So he gets 500 pounds. He wants more. Begins kind of scheming and intriguing. Gets into English jail. In May 1712, he is extradited. They dump him on the Dutch coast. In September 1712, the same year, in Vienna, there is a decree which signed by the emperor, which appoints a Flemish nobleman, Baron de Saint-Hilaire, Joseph de Saint-Hilaire, as the Capitán del Mar y Guerra. Sorry, my Spanish pronunciation. Captain of war and sea in Naples. It's the same person. He claims that when he claimed later on that when he got to The Hague, he got in touch with Duke of Marlborough, who was kind of appalled by the shabby treatment of this distinguished, kind of agent, that that he got so little for his services to the English crown and Spain. So he introduces him to Eugene, to Prince Eugene. But of course, in fact, Duke Marlborough, he arrived to The Hague that year only in December, so they couldn't have met in the Netherlands. Anyhow, he starts a new career as Baron de Saint-Hilaire in the service of the Habsburgs. There are all sorts of conspiracies. He attempts to burn the French navy in Toulon. He's imprisoned in Genoa, in Milan, I think, for an affair with this Genoese lady. Released. Then the Imperials imprison him again in Naples. He escapes again. So, one way or another, by January 1715, he is in St. Petersburg. Allegedly, he's been invited to join Russian service. It's a kind of murky story, not clear. It's neither confirmed nor denied by the Russians who allegedly invited him. Anyhow, when he gets to St. Petersburg, he does two things. First, he gets introduced somehow to the court of Princess Charlotte, who is the wife of Tsarevich Alexei, son and the heir of to the throne, Peter's son. And 2 months later, he is engaged to her favorite lady-in-waiting, who by that time was 38 years old, So for that period, of course, that was, you know, quite, yeah. So I mean, that might be explanation why she kind of jumped on the surf on the you know, on a dashing or whatever. He should have been dashing, you know, Frenchman. But certainly she provides him with a channel of access to the court, to the princess. You know, he gets like all sorts of letters of introduction from her to Russian officials, actually to the English court again. But he also gets to meet Peter, and a few weeks later he produces, you know, a number of projects, and we're going to talk about projectors or projecteurs. A number of projects of very different kind. There is a project on establishing a commission for producing, you know, naval regulations. There is a project for building a little escadra, sort of little flotilla on the Adriatics. So he promised to go there because there's a cheap lumber and cheap sort of artisans and sailors there. So all he needs is a letter of credit. And he also writes a proposal for setting up a naval academy in Russia. And that Peter approves. Now, what does it mean? What exactly does it mean that Peter approves it? How exactly does it work? And what kind of project is that? I mean, first of all, the very project is a verbatim translation of a French 1689, I think, regulation. Sort of he took verbatim 2 sections from the French regulation and just kind of translated them. Now, Peter certainly was interested in training his subjects in things naval, right? I mean, even before that, no question about that. I mean, he was very much involved in sending young Russian nobles to train with the European navies. He was very much interested in just sort of overall pushing Russian nobles to study. You know, sort of in a couple of years before that, he kind of begins to sort of increasingly systematically kind of force like young nobles to come to St. Petersburg to be sort of where he reviews and personally assigns some of them into the service and some of them to study. So this overall framework, this overall interest, right, on Peter's part is certainly there. What's not there is a specific idea to have a naval academy, right? To have a sort of institutionalized school. That and also certainly Peter was familiar with this regulation, with this French regulation, which Saint-Hilaire used. Actually, even before meeting Saint-Hilaire, Peter orders a translation of this regulation, right? But Saint-Hilaire actually didn't use it. I mean, he did his own translation. So this is like, certainly Peter was predisposed towards like, you know, teaching his nobles, instructing them in naval regulations. But the specific idea, the specific institutional form was produced by this guy. Peter approved it in a sense that we have no evidence of Peter actually specifically reacting to this document, right? No corrections, no changes, no paper trail of him like giving sort of like providing any input. So was it like, you know, okay, sir, here's a project. Yeah, fine, okay, great, you know, like do it. I mean, how did it work? I mean, did Peter actually how much Peter actually bought into this idea? How much he actually, you know, was involved in talking about specific details? I mean, we don't know. There is no, I mean, we don't, at least neither me nor my predecessors were actually able to find a copy of the project actually signed by Peter. But we do know that, this guy comes to St. Petersburg in January. In February, he submits a proposal. In the spring, he marries this girl in the presence, well, this lady, in the presence of the court. So it's a kind of, she's a favorite lady, lady in waiting to the crown princess. So it's a kind of court kind of event. Peter is present, his wife, his, you know, like his family, and it is as a part of the celebration, as a part of the, well, as a wedding gift almost, like, you know, it's announced publicly that, you know, the thing that the school is going to be created, this guy is going to be appointed director with the title of general and admiral, both. You know, he will get a good salary, and the school will get a building where, of course, the newlyweds would also reside. In summer of the same year, the thing sort of is set in motion. Students come, you know. So I mean, actually, the school is actually being set up. Now, how much is Peter involved with it later on? I mean, there is one episode when he actually does the right things regarding the school. In October 1715, he approves instruction for this Naval Academy. This instruction is actually, again, written by this guy, St. Hilaire himself. It does have sort of sections added on by Peter in his own hand, but they're added again on request from this guy. So what he does, you know, he writes like rules for the school, and he actually explicitly refers Peter to assign, you know, to establish some punishments for violating those rules, right? So that's what Peter does. He scribbles in, you know, like, and for this, you know, for violating this rule, you know, they should be beaten or whatever, right? So that's his contribution. He does visit the school twice in the fall of that year, in the fall of 1715. Then he departs to Europe again for a year and a half. And the next recorded instance of him visiting the school is 1724, kind of right before his death. And that's also interesting because, you know, there is a wonderful source, so-called campaign journals, basically journals which Peter or his staff kept, where they recorded, you know, like what he has been doing. I mean, those journals, of course, are not complete, right? But they're pretty detailed. I mean, so for many, you know, weeks or days, we know, okay, where he went to eat, where he, let's see, wedding he went to. I know he went to church. You know, he stayed overnight there. He planted apple trees. He went to the hospital to inspect, you know, sick soldiers, whatever. Not a single mention of him ever visiting this all-important, modern, secular school. At the same time, there are like numerous records of him being personally involved with training what he called Gardes Marine, Garde Marine, you know, sort of naval guards, the sort of midshipmen, basically a sort of scheme to train naval officers as apprentices. So many graduates of this naval school, naval academy, they would join this company of Garde Marine, and with that, Peter was very much like hands-on, kind of involved. You know, he would actually make sure that they would get their salaries or stipends are paid. You know, they would be like transferred, assigned. You know, he would like, oh, you know, like, you know, those guys are assigned for training in Venice. You know, but now the Venice is at peace with the Ottomans, so there is not much stuff going on. So like transfer them to Spain instead. You know, like, so that's his project, right? That's his understanding of training. That's what he's kind of very much personally involved with. As for the school, this formal institution, that's just not his kind of thing. To what extent Peter created the school, right? To what extent could you say that he defined or define this sort of its institutional outlook. I would argue that in this case, as in many other cases, yes, he set or other rulers, he set the overall framework, right? He indicated the overall direction, kind of he indicated what sorts of projects would be supported or would be more likely to be supported. Set the boundaries of what's possible, what's not. But otherwise, the specific trajectories, specific institutional shapes, that was very much defined and driven by, yes, administrative entrepreneurs, by people who are hoping to make career by selling expertise, by selling projects, who are hoping to invent jobs for themselves, who are hoping to invent jobs for their clients. But of course, they also needed clients to set up institutions. So that's a kind of mutually reinforcing process. Who are hoping to impress the sovereign by being effective. So if you do a project, right, you also make sure that you present, your achievements, that there are like parades or presentations of the best students, so that your star pupils are taken to the court, and there they recite poems or parade or perform whatever tricks to present you in the best light. If you're important official, you try to do many projects. You might be acting as a broker, right? Kind of all sorts of experts, real or not real experts, or not very real experts. And of course, in that period, the border between real expertise and imposture was really kind of tricky. I mean, this guy, basically the thing, he wasn't really kicked out because, somebody was unhappy with that's the wrong model of school, it's poorly run, whatever. He was kicked out because he got into this ego kind of thing with the Russian aristocrats assigned to supervise him. He thought that the Frenchman thought that, he should have no supervision. If he managed to get along with the Russian guy, he might have well, be listed in history books as this, wonderful, expert whom, Peter wisely invited, to join Russian service. Basically, what I do in my book, I look at the key episodes of institutional innovations like that, beginning from kind of late 17th century and up to Catherine II. And I stopped on the eve of Catherine's reign for a variety of reasons. One of them being that because Catherine is such a huge topic that should be kind of so much stuff going on that that could be a book, a separate book. And basically, I look at the key episodes of institutional innovations in that period in education, kind of new schools being created or reformed, and try to look at them not from the point of view of this kind of progressive teleology, kind of things were developing, becoming more secular, formal, institutionalized, because they had to, right? But rather show how this increase in institutionalization and the creation of new schools, new institutions, their evolution, how it reflects the agendas of different types of entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Thank you. Very entertaining and illuminating.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Sure. Yeah.
What is the language of instruction?
Well, it's a very good question.
Roman or French?
For that period, of course, most of those guys, they didn't know German and French, so it had to be Russian. they sometimes they would involve translators, but also they what they would do, of course. Well, I mean, most teachers were actually Russians, right? So there were few foreigners who kind of would take few Russians who already knew kind of some math, for example. I mean, math. I mean, for those technical schools, of course, math was a key thing, right? Because you needed math for engineering, you needed math for navigation. So those teachers would arrive and they would really kind of work with a few kind of advanced pupils, right? Kind of elder pupils who already know some math, you know, who learned some math in Moscow and who also know some foreign languages. So they would be instructing those Russians in sort of advanced math, while those, you know, kind of apprentices, right, would in turn be instructing, you know, the sort of the beginners, right? So yeah, so that was mostly Russian. Yeah.
I have a similar
Or-
question. I understood from
Mm.
some things that I read that Peter, everywhere he went
Mhm.
in Europe,
Right.
in whichever area he
Right.
worked, in shipbuilding or
Right,
whatever,
yeah.
he took up so many different
Right.
things while he was abroad.
Right.
He would pick experts
Right.
in that particular
Right.
field, and he would send them or take them
Right.
to Russia.
Right.
So he also had this huge entourage of
Right.
young people
Oh, absolutely,
who
yeah.
were learning
Right.
as apprentices
Right.
or whichever way. And so what he would do, so these people would go back,
Right.
and I would have assumed that they would have
Right.
instructors to the Russians.
Right.
Whereas there was that whole group of foreigners
Right.
living in St. Petersburg
Right.
that was like that whole quarter.
Right.
And there, I would have assumed that some of these people would be training the
Right.
the people from the court
Right.
or his from his
Right.
regiments and leaders
Right.
that
Right.
way. So as far and then you have the other side
Right.
where Peter was very much against all the backwardness of tradition and
Right. Yeah.
and he wanted people in general to kind of shed that
Right.
and kind of move into the modern
Right.
world. So I was kind of looking to hearing a little
Mm.
bit, not just about the admiralry and that. I was kind of hoping to hear a little bit more if there were any way that education, even if he did not organize
Right.
personally, because he
Right,
was
right,
a busy man,
right.
but we knew he had certain interests and
Right,
those
right.
he focused on.
Right.
But was there a movement
Right.
by the rest of the, I know nobility
Right,
also
right,
may
right,
not have
right.
wanted everybody educated,
Right.
but you see what I'm getting of
No.
educating the Russians in general.
Well, I mean, well, I mean, movement. You mean like, you know, kind of sort of from below, kind of, right?
Well, no, not just from below, from him to say to his people, I have been abroad,
Right.
I've seen how
Right.
things function, let's see what we can do here, and if there were any takers.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, I guess that's you're absolutely right, and I'm certainly I guess that's exactly what I'm saying, right? In the sense that, you know, that he sets his direction, and then there are people who want to exploit this sort of overall kind of, you know, message to make careers or to
Any results from any efforts? How far did he move Russia from before he was there in general terms of educating the Russians either in particular areas
right.
or in general? some
Well,
kind
I
of
mean,
basic-
I'm afraid it's impossible to say, you know, sort of like how far kind of moved or didn't move. I mean, that's what does really kind of movement mean? I mean, like, what do you mean, like rates of literacy or?
I'd say, yeah,
Well, that's impossible to say. That's impossible to say. But certainly, you're absolutely right that, you know, there was there were both sort of Russians who went abroad and who came back, and many of whom, you know, tried to make careers by kind of selling their, I mean, whatever skills they've sort of acquired, but also foreigners whom they invited. But I mean, here again, I mean, there is this probably sort of most famous foreign teacher of the period, most important, called Henry Farquharson, the Scotsman. So I mean, Peter personally hires him while in London in the end of the 17th century. He personally hires him, invites him to come to Russia. He does that with two sort of assistants. But what happens then is that he sits in Moscow like for 2 years, you know, and there is like no evidence of Peter actually sort of kind of being involved in kind of setting up a school, whatever. And I mean, again, you know, Peter was pretty busy, you know, with like doing like all those wars and, you know, diplomacy and rebellions. But sort of when the thing actually kind of moves ahead is when this guy, projector, sort of a profiteer, whatever you call him, sort of inventor of new things, kind of comes along. This guy sort of who promotes himself by sort of by submitting all sorts of projects to Peter, by advising Peter on all sorts of things. And one of the things, you know, he takes over those teachers, requests Peter to appoint him to be in charge of the school, sort of. Finds a way to actually redirect funding from a different source, because he's also official elsewhere. So he's official at the armory, right? So he requests that those teachers be transferred to the armory, so that now he could use, you know, the armory funding to actually to fund the thing. He also uses, you know, this new school. He gets Peter to sign a decree, like setting up a school, but then he uses the school to employ his kind of own friends, which doesn't mean that, you know, it's like all the terrible. I mean, his friends are actually, you know, educated and sort of, and you know, turn out to be pretty good teachers and a pretty sort of important cultural initiative. He uses the school to promote himself later on. I mean, immediately when they do this, when they start the school, they write a textbook of their own. And they prepare this, you know, very sort of luxurious edition, you know, sort of very nicely kind of done on expensive paper, and sort of presented to Peter, saying like, look at us, we've done that. I mean, we're your faithful servants. We need to be rewarded, by the way. And just to finish it up, and actually what happens is that, yes, I mean, Peter sends this overall message, but then, you know, there are like, you know, like really lots of kind of, well, private teachers or private initiatives to instruct, you know, nobility. Foreign teachers come into kind of to practice, you know, either trying to get support from Peter or just like privately kind of practicing teachers. Prisoners of war trying to earn money by, you know, by teaching the Swedes. Or all sorts of Russians kind of trying to earn extra money, you know, like by just teaching basic literacy. So I mean, you really kind of find this movement, as you say, kind of sort of in reaction to Peter's kind of sort of vague push, you know, kind of there is a thing. So
Even his army,
yeah.
his army begins when
Yeah.
you know, I read recently
Yeah.
something where his army begins with, you know, being so disorganized and really kind of lacking
Well,
of Europe
well.
until, and then afterwards they really have checked during his reign. He's much more.
Well, I mean, disorganized is a tricky thing, because, you know, I mean, well, I mean, in the sense that, you know, like, when you want to kind of to do reform, and when you want to sell yourself as a great reform, I mean, that's what you say. Oh, they're so disorganized, you know, I must be appointed to kind of shape them up. So it's kind of tricky, but yeah, but you're right. Yeah.
My question.
Yeah.
Do you use electronic databases, resources from the Library of Congress, Woodrow Wilson?
Of course, sure, yeah, sure, yeah. No, I mean, that's tremendous help, and you know, there are all those, and of course, our articles and the, and now that so many books are, especially older books, are available, you know, as the sort of digitized, you know,
What's
the
the
co-
number one, for example?
the resource. Well, I mean, of course, I use JSTOR, of course, right? I mean, that's for like also Java magazine articles. I use sort of like here. It's really great to be able to use how it's pronounced, hey, HashiTrust. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great great resource for like older books where you could yeah, sort of download things and yeah. Yeah. I mean, going beyond the Library of Congress, of course, the one sort of the really amazing thing which the French have is a thing called Gallica, where you could actually do, I know, with all those old books, sort of kind of scanned copies, you could actually do kind of, like keyword search. They have this sort of like, word recognition software which allows you to search, through like 17th century books, kind of. That's like really amazing and helpful, kind of.
It's a website of the National Gallery.
Yeah, national, yeah, no. Bibliothèque Nationale, oui.
I wanted to ask you a question. Well, during your talk, you focused on.
I would ask you to speak up with the question so the
Oh,
questions are
okay.
Well, you focused on the Naval Academy.
Right.
I'm interested about other schools
Mm-hmm.
and how popular they were and what was the reaction of society.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
If you could repeat the question.
Right. Yeah. So the overall sort of other schools and like how did the population react? I think it actually reacted pretty positively, in a sense that I know there is this myth that they're all like against learning. I don't think we actually have direct evidence for that. What they were against actually is they were against like being forced to do things which did not correspond to their life and career strategies. And that was really important, and that changes kind of throughout that period. Because what happens initially, say around 1700, say this navigation school is created, everybody is invited, they pay this small stipend, so they actually have lots of people coming to study there. Of course, that's not the boyars, not the princes, right? It's like usually petty nobility, sons of soldiers, orphans, all those kind of like poor boys who really kind of want to get the small stipend, for whom it's important. They come like in hundreds. Sort of the higher aristocracy. Well, they lots of them like go ahead and enroll in schools too. But of course, they prefer to enroll into other schools. For example, there is this like private school run by the German German pietist sort of pastor who provides he presents it as a gymnasium, right? So he presents it as a sort of more like kind of more refined education, kind of which more fits their self-perception as a part of the sort of European nobility, right? So there you would have like fencing and sort of horse riding and sort of more of the sort of Ritter Academy kind of type of education, and they go there too on their own. When it does change is when around 1715 he actually tries to push them all into schools, and into schools where he wants them to be, not where they want to be, right? For example, he bans all the sort of like non-nobles from entering this navigation school and naval academy, and instead forces higher nobility to go into naval academy, which doesn't fit their life strategies, which is really expensive. And one of the reasons why they force this, why they want to force the high nobility in the naval academy, because it's in St. Petersburg. It's really expensive to live there because it's far away from the major kind of population center. So it's like really all the supplies are really expensive there, and they really, by that time the war's been going on for like 20 years. They really don't have the money, so they want them to kind of to live on their own, to use their own kind of money. and people kind of like are really unhappy about that. And there is like no clear no clear algorithm for promoting them. So like earlier in this navigation school, like lower in ability, sons of soldiers, I mean, they were happy just to get their salary and to get, like entry-level job as some, scribes or technicians or money counters. And now you have those princes, who spend like, like whatever number of years at this naval academy, have to pay for that, and don't have like any clear career prospects, because I mean, after graduation they get into this sort of Gardes des Marines. The Great Northern War ends, so there is like demand for naval officers, is lower. Like promotion is much lower because people not being killed, like every year, right? So like no openings, and they're like stuck there like for 10 years without any promotions. Or of course they resist that. Of course they try to evade that. So what happens in the 1730s is that they actually all the nobles still have to serve and still have to study, but what they do, they actually give them freedom of choice. They let them themselves choose, between sort of going to school or going straight into regiments as private soldiers and making their career there. And they give them a choice of, give them a sort of right to choose between different schools. Actually, when young nobles come to this place called the heraldry, the special office, which registers young nobles for service and then kind of supervises their careers, or kind of each sort of human resources kind of office, on the imperial scale. And they actually ask them, where do you want to serve, and they record their preferences. And I've actually looked into that, and the sort of an article came out in the Journal of Social History just in its latest issue. But in about 2/3 of cases, they actually appoint them according to their preferences, right? And that works much better, in the sense that that there are actually people who, for whatever reasons, because of family connections, family preferences, who opt for schools, and then there are this other people who opt for, just joining service as private soldiers, and it works. So freedom is important. Freedom of choice, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What happened to this fellow Hilaire after
Yeah,
the thing for 2 years?
yeah, he's kicked out. I mean, the last so the latest we hear from him is I mean, he hangs out in St. Petersburg for like about a year and a half, kind of tries to get his kind of his salary kind of due to him, tries to get a new appointment, and then in 1720 he goes over to the Swedes. And the latest, the last kind of thing I was able to find about him is his letter to the Swedish admiral, kind of advising him on how to attack the Russian-held Reval, present-day Tallinn. So like so let's say long and windy road, yeah.
So how Peter's reform inspired today's Russian civilization reform?
Well, yeah, no, I mean it's.
I mean, I know the Russian education is in the flux amongst two.
Right. Well, I mean, of course, education is always in the flux, Yeah. No. Well. That's a good question. Certainly, I wouldn't say that right now that Peter is the most popular of the rulers. So I mean, it's sort of in the official discourse, in a sense that this idea of kind of learning from Europeans kind of sounds a little bit kind of questionable. Also, there is a large difference in the sense that there is a huge difference in the sense that Yes, I mean there are like all sorts of reform initiatives in Russian education, kind of. It's been going on for the past like 10 years, whatever. But at the same time, certainly, I would say that for President Putin, you know, education and science, it's not his thing, right? I mean, he doesn't have this. I mean, there are like areas where, sort of, once again, he's kind of passionate about, right? And sort of, and education is not one of them. So it's much more, again, you know, about project, about, you know, important dignitaries, important ministers, you know, peddling various visions, various projects. And President Putin kind of like saying, yeah, okay, like whatever. And then, you know, it's like, you know, it's like kind of driven by career, by ambitions, by rent seeking, by so yeah, sort of individual administrative entrepreneurs.
And all the ways.
Well, but I mean, I think there is. I mean, that's how. Yeah, well,
I
no.
think the Russians is more likely to be imposed from above the other reforms. It's very likely to the China's, you know, the English to not instead of, you know, raise from below.
Well, actually, I'm trying to make an argument that it's actually from below.
Really,
Yeah, well, that's what I've been trying to say, kind of. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's it's much kind of. Much less kind of top down, much less kind of directed from the very top, much more sort of, you know, growing up from below, from, you know, or okay, maybe not from below, but from the kind of from the middle level kind of, yeah.
it's interesting.
Listen, we'll have to stop there. Thank you all for coming, Professor Fedyukhin. Really, thank you. That was
Thank
really
you.
quite nice.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.